Our next session will move straight on to storytelling with data. Making the presentation is a partner in the advisory services of EY with a specialization in governance, risk and control solutions. A chartered accountant and certified internal auditor with nearly 2 decades of professional experience, he has led several large and complex projects relating to internal audit, SOX 404, enterprise risk management, design of processes, business plan reviews, strategic cost reduction, revenue assurance, and forensic reviews. His primary focus was on the telecom sector. Additionally, he also leads EY's Risk Analytics program. He's also been instrumental in organizing the Internal Auditors Roundtable in Mumbai over the last year. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome Shailin Desai.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon all. I thought I'll just make it a little lighter in sync with the subject for the discussion, which is telling stories, right? So while my colleague sets it up, we're going to break the whole discussion in 3 parts. One is just setting the context. Second is a very simple framework for storytelling. And third is I want to share some actual examples of how powerful storytelling was in certain scenarios, including something which was voted as the most effective infographic ever produced in the world. So I'll show that up and we can all take learnings to our daily life. Yeah, now not to waste time on the presentation being set up, when we talk about storytelling, right, and we all know in our profession, many a battle have been lost and won just on the basis of how we conveyed a particular issue to the management, to the board. In my experience of 18 years, I have seen best of technical work, best of issues, best of risks being identified, falling through the cracks just because the story wasn't there. And I'm sure as we reflect, if you reflect your individual journey or what you've seen around, there will be many such examples of, as I said, winning the battle or losing it. So that's really sets the really counting terms of why storytelling is so critical with data. I mean, we go home, obviously, right, end of a long, tiring day, but if there's a late night movie, right, everybody sits up because we all want to hear a story, right? So story is something which really keeps people interested. And there was a very nice research very recently produced, and we all talked about analytics. I remember last year II conference we discussed analytics. And after 1 year, what's really coming to light is that as people progress and mature towards analytics and finding patterns and red flags and various scenarios popping out, what is missing is really that human element of storytelling with that. So you have various fancy bubble charts, line graphs, dotted lines, all being different colors being presented. But a story is missing there. And that's why, at least what we've seen now in our organization also, as soon as the guys who start the work at EY, we get them to orient more towards storytelling than just report writing, which was probably what was true a decade ago. So as I move up, yeah, this is what is the agenda for today. So let's quickly get on the first part. So why they say that, why tell a story? Now you reflect on some of the work which you have done, which even today, your management, your board, your team members, when you're sitting alone, you reflect and, manage a smile. Why are those memorable? Perhaps there was a very compelling story behind that. That's why it's extremely important. Second is relatable. And that's a very nice example here. There was this agency which did a small experiment. So they were into charity. And they put up a particular stall. And the brochure there was just about facts. that we will collect so much out of whatever is corpus collected, we will spend so much on charity, blah, blah, blah. All statistics around collection, deployment, etc. The second stall, same objective, right, which was to increase collection. The second stall had a small story about how a girl child's life would be changed using this collection. So it did not talk about facts about corpus, how much will be spent, how much in urban, rural, all of those, dry data points. It talked about really how a child, a girl child growing up, how that charity fund helped that girl child to be successful in life. And guess what? It's obvious, right? Which one would have got higher collections? Right? So that shows the power of storytelling. And Anita, can we just go back? I think there's one more. This also shows that sometimes the storytelling is such, and for us in intern audit, the biggest challenge always is to get management to take action. And the storytelling is the best way to take action, as I just explained in this anecdote. So therefore, just to conclude on the context setting, as I said, facts gets recorded, but stories get remembered. And this is true.
I think just to add to what Shailen just said, even as companies, you must have seen largely when we watch an advertisement or when we hear a story, I think it is the human connect to that story that really influences us to buy. Sometimes even between two products, the differentiation must be just marginal. Maybe between two audit firms, between two auditors, but it is the personal connect. It is the person, the story that you relate to. That is where your affluence always lies. So as individuals, as companies, and as auditors, it is very important to know what is the story that you want to present and who is your audience.
Yeah. So moving on, what's a very simple framework which can be easily adopted by us, our teams, those who are new to intern audit. And this framework, just simple three components. The first, on top you see the visual design. And this, sometimes we are guilty of underplaying the importance of visual design, but this is really half the battle won. So whether you use, say, a simple flowchart techniques or a more recent software programs like Microsoft Power BI, Tableau, and I'll talk about that a little later, it's very important to select the correct visual design, which is appropriate to the story which you, or the issue which you're trying to convey through a story. So that's really the first part, which is really how do you show your story. And just remember these three framework elements when I showcase some of the actual work done, so that we could sort of find a direct connection as to how a combination of these three framework elements resulted in a very powerful data being conveyed, a story being conveyed. The second is messaging. And though I did mention that half the battle is won with visual design, but if you really don't have content, it will fall flat, right? So if there's a very simple issue like, okay, somebody has not signed off a particular one document out of 100, I mean, you may create a fancy visuals around it, but if there is so weak content, the story will fall flat, absolutely flat. Even if you have, as I said, the best of visual design depicting that. The third is really interactivity. And this, again, in intern audit, we find very important element of keeping your auditee involved. Sometimes we are all guilty of, just forming a conclusion and thrusting it down. How do we really make the entire process interactive, which is convey the story in a way the auditee is asking question, oh, how did that happen? Oh, how did you find this out, etc. So a very important element of storytelling is also how do we keep the whole stuff interactive. And as I said, all these three elements, I'll just show you how it all comes to play when I flash some of the examples. Now, another very important learning, again, we've realized over time is a lot of people sometimes mistake the same storytelling option irrespective of who the auditee is. So whether it's a C-level guys or a heads of department or just, let's say, a mid-management, sometimes they repeat the same story. And unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that the audience being different, the story narrative or the story theme has to be little changed. And there are two types of storytelling options we have. One, which is classically called author-driven. This is what C-level people want. Don't leave judgment or don't leave interpretation to me. You're the author, you form conclusion, tell me. So that's a story where you don't leave anything to interpretation. It's facts stated, conclusions drawn, next steps clearly laid out. That's author-driven. Very, very important. Speed, more direct for C-level, audit committee members, etc. The second option is what is typically reader-driven. This is very, very interactive, where there are options for reader to interpret. You have living, subtle messages to be interpreted, something which, as I said, you may not want to put down in writing. And this is really, as I said, a reader-driven option. And if you really map out the next slide, and I hope, yeah, it's the key stakeholders, and you will find that, as I mentioned, C-level guys clearly like author-driven. That's the style they want. But the departmental guys, the middle management, they would want a more element of reader-driven options coming in. So the point I'm trying to make here is that depending on who the audience is, author versus reader-driven styles are very, very important. And that needs to be taken cognizance of.
To add to what Shailen just said, I think it's important that we know who our readers are, but sometimes we are in a precarious situation where a balanced approach needs to be taken. For instance, a lot of times when we start with our clients, there is a more reader-driven approach because there are multiple scenarios that are being discussed, there are various options which are being laid out. But as we try and explore those options, as we try and see what is the risk that the client is trying to address, that's when we narrow down that approach to make it more author-driven. That's when we know that where do we want to focus our energy, where do we want to make a clear, concise approach to address the issue. So a lot of times in our situations, it could be that we start with a reader-driven approach and end up with an author-driven approach based on who our audience is and what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and that's an important point that most often as the team members start up drafting an issue and then concluding it at the overall level, this transition will typically happen, which is, okay, you'll have probably more of reader-driven approach, and in the end, you'll want. So the best way to test your work is really when you present or provide a summary to your CEOs and the audit committee members to really say that, have you ticked off all those elements which are in the author-driven storytelling box? If not, then maybe it requires some improvement in terms of additional message or additional story being told. So moving on, I'm not sure whether the bubbles are as visible on the screen, but briefly I did talk about the design is half the battle won. So this is very simple stuff from what Obama did. So when he came into, obviously one of the bills once they passed on, they represented the whole data in a simple bubble chart, which is to say where the budgets were being assigned to, what's the budgetary allocation to different functions, different departments, how do they compare with the previous year. You'll find the ones which are green color means the budgetary sanction has increased. The size of budget denotes an absolute value in $1 billion. And the ones which are red denotes that, okay, for those functions, the budgets have reduced. And therefore, if look at, just use this example and just look at you reviewed procurement. Or let's say a sales, zonal sales. And initially, when you start off and identifying patterns, trends, where maybe risks are higher, which needs further verification, you represent data in this form, and then focus on the ones which are red, and then deep dive. Instead of a very classical tabular statistics to say, okay, fine, the company had so many purchase orders, they procured X crores worth of materials, blah, blah, blah. So this is a very powerful way, as I said, to present a very, very simple, let's say, summary or a population of, let's say, a purchase order, whatever the audit area you assigned to, how you could start off with that. This is what exactly Obama did to drive home the point about where he's increasing the budget support, what areas he's cutting down, etc.
I think just to add to that, the whole idea behind visual design is to not fit the design into the story, but to visualize the story and then find the appropriate design. Very often as auditors, our creative imagination is limited to bar graphs, pie charts, but the whole idea is to say, does that do justice to my story? Is that the right medium to express my story? And to really look back and say, how would I want to narrate the story rather than how would I want to present the information?
Yeah, so just want to leave behind on this section one simple message. The framework has 3 elements. The visual design is half the battle won, but content needs to be there as well, and introduce that interactivity into it. So let's move on to the actual examples. Just as I said, only one point to reiterate is that if you don't have a good story, no visuals will help. So let's look at the first one. This is the US defense budget. Okay. Maybe come back to this.
Sure.
Yeah. Now just look at this. Okay. Now this is the military spent by different countries a year ago. So one option was, this is a typical TIPCO Spotfire option where you just sort of present in a very simple rectangle formation. You see, so it's very obvious that which country spends the max. The one in green is the US, right? So it's very obvious that the total military spend in $1 billion, US is number 1, right? Now to put that into perspective, you add a layer to say, okay, the one which you just saw, the red one, is the entire Africa continent's debt. So one conclusion is that the US military spend is far higher than even the entire African continent debt as of 2015. Now you move on. Another way to represent the whole story is to say that, okay, the US defense spend is more than sum total of the rest 9, if you slice just top 10 spenders in absolute dollar value. So that's one more way to represent the story, to say, okay, classically sometime when we talk about over-reliance on supplier or over-dependency on one vendor, those are typical issues which sometimes come up. This is a classical way to convey the story that, okay, US or vendor X is doing far, far higher or higher than the rest 9 combined. Now another interesting statistics or story which came out actually is this. So far in our story, US was seen to be the one spending maximum. Now the perspective here is that when you apply it as a percentage of GDP, which is perhaps a real measure on who is spending the highest, risk under the radar, right? You'll find strangely, number 1, that country is Oman. So Oman is spending 14% on defense. This is 14% of its GDP on defense. And if this is a classic example of conveying a story around risk under radar. Who is that person? Who is that vendor? Who is that customer? Who is that employee operating under radar? Today, because in absolute sense, Oman stacked behind, but in terms of the emerging risk, here is it. So the same data points can be used to convey a very, very different story. Now it's up to us, depending on the context of your organization, context of the issue, whether you want to represent US is the largest spender or Oman is the one to watch out for. I guess Pakistan would rank very much similar to Oman, huh? Right. Now let's look at, sometime back I mentioned about a very, very powerful infographic, and this was it was through voting. So this was voted as the most powerful story ever conveyed. And you see the heading is, Iraq's bloody toad. It's what really happened there post-90s, right? So in this story and in the way the visual design is, you'll find the color clearly depicts blood, and the whole visuals is inverted. So X and Y axis, you'll find it inverted. Therefore, the impression it gives, which is consistent with the heading, is blood spilling over. It's a very, very gory picture in that sense, right? The visuals, the story matching content. It is getting that desired impact on the listener, reader, viewer. Now let's play with this. Okay, same fact. Let's turn it around. Suddenly, it's not as bad as what it was in the earlier graphic. And now, if I just change the color and change the heading, it's very interesting. The entire story changes. If you see on the right-hand side, which talks about the count of fatal incidents, it's declining. The heading of this story is really, it's the same content, same data point, through storytelling, through visual, it's changed the entire conclusion. Here, the author is saying that death on the decline. It's painting a slightly, or let's say a positive outlook to the same thing. And this is so very true sometimes of our audit. Sometimes, depending on what, again, the context is, we may want management to be shaken up. You need to go back to the first gory picture, right? Convey a story in that form, which strikes. But if you don't want to make a huge noise, unnecessary, hype around an important issue, want to make it subtle but action-oriented, then this style probably conveys equally a positive flavor to it. So again, another example of same data content, same issue, but the story could be different, conclusions are different, conveyed in a very different visual form. If you just go back to today, there are 4 or 5 good software options available, and the next one I wanted to show has one of that, so I thought I'll just cover this element. So if you really see today, and these are the software tools, not very expensive, nor very cumbersome or difficult to use. So Tableau was something which was very, very popular, started quite some time back, so it has a license cost to it, but very, very easy to use. Another option is Microsoft Power BI. Right now, the basic license is free because they are promoting it. It has the same feature as Tableau, and those who are obviously well versed with MS Office can easily, very easily adopt to Microsoft Power BI. And the best part of MS Power BI is that it can be downloaded as an app on your iPhone, iPad, and you could send a notification to, let's say, your team leader, your head of intern audit, your C-level, HOD, through that. So erstwhile we used to talk about, okay, if there's a serious issue, send a flash report. You can move on to a notification mode using Microsoft Power BI. The third is TIBCO Spotfire. We saw that US thing that was, again, an option. So today, there are in the market, as I said, we've sort of ranked 6, which we believe are fairly relevant to intern audit work, easy to use, not very expensive. So you could consider adopting some of that. My personal choice among this is Microsoft Power BI, and that's why the next one, the graphic is on that. And this is a very simple issue, which was a classic issue sometimes happens, right? That, okay, you develop in your audit report, so simple exhibit to convey. And here is an example which says that the vendor, or rather an employee, is also setting himself up as a vendor in the system. And through audit work, because the PAN number was common, you have identified that. So it's a simple exhibit which conveys that, okay, here is this employee, but this employee also is running a shop and setting it up as a vendor to the company, and there are transactions. Now instead of that table, now this is a classic way, and the screen is not very clear. The bottom is that Excel sheet, the table. So some of the more classical minded people can look at that. But the portions above that, you see, is that interactive element. So what happens is that once you share this with the auditee, the whole interactive element comes up. Oh, hey, Mr. X is there? Tell me how much business has he done. You click on him, immediately the number of transactions, the volume of the value of those purchases or spend come up. It's fairly interactive. You send it over notification, as I told you. The auditee, your management, they can play around and explore. So this is a full chart. He or she can explore your data the way he or she wants, right? So this really allows a very interactive type of storytelling than a very, very, as I said, a simple fact base. Okay, I've reviewed this, and there are 10 people who set it up as a vendor, and matter ends there. A very, very basic audit risk issue, but you could convey it through a very, very nice interactive storytelling method. We got another one, which is a very simple one for hotels, right? Most of the hotel, they do this night audit. And what you typically find is allowances and all being missed out. So checkout has happened, and then in the evening, somebody then waves it off. And then you send like the long sheets of paper. This is like something which is like a interactive dashboard daily. The HOD, the audit head gets it, which really is interactive to say, okay, who passed on those waivers? What was the value of the waivers? Total waivers passed. You see that one, the dark color circle. What is the percentage of waivers passed after checkout time? And as a various variables, as you start clicking, different data points come up, which really completes the whole story. And you see the ones on the right are all those employees who are passing off. You can then focus on, okay, these 3 employees, the issue was with training, these 4 employees, the issue was something else, etc., etc. So you could really use this, a very, very simple interactive style to complete and convey the story during an audit closure process. So, in a nutshell, the point really is that today, storytelling, perhaps because nobody really has got time, is really becoming a way to be remembered. As I said, many battles have been won or lost just on the way you convey your issue, your message to the board. And storytelling in intern audit, howsoever we would like to think we are very serious type of auditors, but storytelling is clearly very, very, very critical going forward. So I got a couple of more thoughts, but I'll pause for any questions at this stage before I conclude. Any experiences somebody would like to share? Interesting story you conveyed, which was very well received. Okay, none. So, all right. Either we've been very clear or we've done a very bad job, Niyati. So,
I'm hoping the first one.
all right. So just allow.
Somebody has a question, sure.
Yeah.
On the interfaces, as we see, since you said storytelling, that is definitely, as you said, the visual appeal would be there. My thought goes to the accuracy of the data. See, somewhere at the back end there would be an interface, whether it is the ERP or whether it's whatever it is. Now, how does one actually assess that the data that has come up, it is online? So, what are the controls that we would like to establish as the auditor that yes, this is what has happened, and now I'm able to tell the story. So that should also get captured somewhere, is what I feel.
Okay, so to your question, I think we dealt more about, the actual work was, the content was given.
Yeah.
Okay, it is accurate, etc.
Yeah.
The
This
whole
is the
discussion
presentation part, what you are.
yeah, how do you really convey that content? So it was all about, that the whole experience. Sometimes people do to use this word. What was the audit experience like, right? After the report, they send like a feedback form to auditee. So this was this whole experience part. How do you translate that? And we didn't really focus on basically the whole audit process as such. Yeah. But as I said, any visualization, any smart, really appealing stuff without content or with erroneous content, obviously will fall flat. Okay, so, yep.
So I'll share an experience, particularly it's on the content, how we went about. It was huge data analytics that the internal audit team was asked to do. So broadly, this was the legal and professional spend, and the analytics story would be always which department, which team, which business has done this every time. So broadly, we made a story from the data, putting it somewhere based on the assessment of the cost. Because I come from pharma industry, we put what is IP and pharma specific, what are rule-based, which are our statutory cost, which are our which are very required regulatory-wise. Then we went down to do judgmental costs, which are very, like you do a market research, which is a requirement, or some initiatives that are taken which are not mandatory for the business. So this kind of storytelling and using Tableau also, and that helped us actually in getting it to the management, and also it helped us to reduce the FY18 cost. So
Yeah, yeah.
one example.
Absolutely, and I've seen also people sometimes to supplement the digital form carry a physical media form, and there was this classic. There's this company Torrent. They manufacture I think Corax syrup. So I remember this was like almost a decade ago now. So the 50 and 100 ml bottle had the same dimensions. So once you do a classical CNF agents audit, there was this typical check whether before destroying, whether the seal is intact, etc. And you can't make out from the seal, from that part, a broken bottle, the cap, that it's 100 ml or 50 ml. And once you plot data, you'll find that the dealers were always claiming that, 100 ml bottle broke, and it was clearly improbable that how in the history 50 ml bottle never broke. It was always 100 ml bottle. And the storytelling in the audit committee, sometimes in that I remember we supplemented that by actually carrying samples of the actual and as I said, those are the issues sometimes people even today will remember that, well, that you guys conveyed their story, you got the broken bottle, the upper portion, it just hit them. So sometimes to your point, yes, supplementing the digital media form, electronic form, a physical form also becomes a very powerful tool to use.
I have one more example in the process audits. Sometimes for the audit observations, we also take photos, actually, videos and photos, and that help a lot when you are interacting with C-level executives and management, because sometimes even when the facts are there, the photos and the videos, they throw everything on face, and the interaction and the action then is very oriented. So that also is very helpful, actually.
Because intrinsically, it's a classic thing, right? Audio versus video, why video is more powerful than audio. Once you see something, it just initiates intrinsically a lot of action. And if you recall, I had mentioned that facts get recorded, stories get remembered. So that's a classic example of you moved away from facts, but to story. Great. So let me just leave all of you with just one thought that once we hit the ground back next week or Friday, we have this whole concept of dashboard. Whenever you now make a dashboard, can you think and just remember this visual to say, it's no longer now a dashboard I'm making, but it's now a storyboard I'm making. So if you can just carry this image back, whenever you hit ground next, I'm confident it will greatly improve the impact of the work which we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's hear it for Shailin Desai and his colleague. I'd like to request Mr. Percy Amal Sadiwala to kindly do the honors and present a memento to Shailin Desai. Thank you very much. We'll have a photograph of the three of you. Thank you very much once again.